Hello everyone, this is Scarzig, and welcome back to another Design Talk. The preview event for Legends of Runeterra, the new card game from Riot Games, has just concluded, and everyone is flooding the developers with tons of great feedback. While I've already passed along my thoughts on other parts of the game, I felt that this particular subject deserved a bit more of a deep dive. So let's jump right in and talk about Legends of Runeterra's Fiora problem. For those unfamiliar, in Legends of Runeterra, Fiora is a champion card that, after killing 2 enemies in combat, levels up, and then, if she kills 2 more, you win the game instantly. And it sounds really ridiculous when you say it out loud like that, but Fiora also has the challenger keyword, and that means she gets to choose her target when she attacks, and pick the best trades for herself. Now, I will compliment Riot's ambitiousness in including an alternate win condition type card in the very first set like this, but this one is just poorly implemented and unhealthy for the game for a number of reasons. Firstly, for a card like this to be implemented so early in the game's lifespan, the developers are very heavily restricting the kinds of cards and effects that they can add to the game later on for fear of adding additional power and utility to a card like this. To be honest, when I first saw Fiora's effect, I actually felt it was a bit redundant, since in a broad card game value sort of sense, if any unit were to survive long enough to trade into 4 other enemy units and still be alive, you're most likely already winning the game pretty hard at that point. But this ends up being a problem in other games, since in alternate win condition normally makes a player accomplish a specific difficult task that's wildly different from what a normal playstyle would consist of. Magic the Gathering actually has several interesting examples, which I'll put over here for y'all to look at. Probably some, for those of you who are more versed, are familiar with a few of these options. Now, historically, decks built around cards like these are pretty inconsistent because, as is the nature of card games, sometimes you don't draw your win condition at all. And 2, if they don't complete their alternate win condition, it's almost impossible for that deck to win through normal means. You end up having to go all in on your win condition, right? But Fiora gives the player the benefit of just sort of playing the game normally, and sometimes you get to instantly win. Trading into enemy units in a game like this is just a pretty common thing that's going to happen no matter what. And even if you don't draw Fiora, the deck will still pack enough power and value to still eke out wins without much difficulty. So you can see how Fiora sort of violates a couple of the most common tenets of what would constitute an alternate win condition. She functions more like an additional win condition. But the other part of the argument is the fact that it actually is not that difficult to accomplish her goal of killing 4 enemies at all. Now, there is a handful of cards that are already meant to synergize with Fiora to help her survive, kill her targets, and achieve that condition. Some of them more optimal than others. But Fiora is mostly backed by tons of cards from the Demacian and Ionian regions that grant her the keyword Barrier, absorbing the first instance of damage against her so that she can attack enemies without taking damage in return. And the first one on, this massive list is, of course, the champion Shen. He grants Barrier to his supported ally, and if he's leveled up, his allies will also gain 3 attack power when they get that Barrier. Shen no longer needs to be the source for them to gain that attack, by the way. We also have the Bright Steel Defender from Demacia, which is perfectly well statted for its cost, grants Barrier to an ally. The Ionian spell Key Guardian, right? It's a burst spell, so it's unreactable, and it also draws a card, one of the few sources of decent card draw in the game. We also have Prismatic Barrier, another burst spell, granting Barrier, and Spirit's Refuge, which is one of the few sources of lifesteal in the game, which offers the deck additional insurance against aggressive decks. So when Fiora is in play, additional copies you might draw become copies of Fiora's Riposte for more barrier, and it gives 3 attack, just in case you tried to block Fiora with something with enough HP to not die to her. Plus, it shuffles another copy into your deck. Oh, and it's also a burst spell. And this ties into another mechanic. Again, in Legends of Runeterra, when you have a champion in play, additional copies of that champion transform into their signature spell. And when Shen is in play, additional copies of him become Shen's Stand United, which swap the position of 2 allies, grant them both barrier, and it allows you even more control over Fiora's combat targets, and is keeping with the theme, a burst spell. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why I'm emphasizing the fact that all of these are burst spells, and it's because you can't play anything on reaction to them to swing the combat back into your favor necessarily, but it's also due to the fact that burst spells cannot be counteracted by the Ionian bombshell, Deny. Now, Deny is a 3-mana fast spell that completely negates a spell or skill, but is only available to the Ionian region, which means, you guessed it, decks running Fiora will also run this spell in order to nullify your attempts to remove Fiora from the field, or to just play any other sort of positive effect you might want for your game plan. Now, Deny and its implications for the meta itself is a subject that deserves its own video. A lot of players have been giving feedback about Deny, and this is something I hope the developers look into. But suffice to say, the point is that Fiora decks get to abuse Deny while simultaneously being functionally immune to it. So I feel I've outlined how the deck violates several facets of what actually makes an alternate win condition in card games fun and interesting. But I also talked about how the deck has too much synergy and strength, just raw power, but not enough counterplay, right? But let's say that despite everything, you have an incredibly large brain and you've managed to play around Fiora. Maybe your opponent draws her later into the game. Maybe they didn't have the Deny and your removal went through. You've managed to kind of keep her at bay, maybe with some stuns or what have you. You've danced the dance, you've outplayed your opponent, and you've built up enough board advantage and whittled down the enemy nexus just enough that you're now ready to swing in with all of your units and get the lethal. Wow, what a fantastic play. You're a genius. Congratulations. But that is not the case. The enemy casts Judgment, and you lose the game immediately. You see, Judgment makes an ally deal damage equal to its power to all attacking enemies. It works similarly to the Fiora deck's sexy spot removal single combat, but this combo will allow a fresh Fiora to potentially slay 4 enemies all in one go, and yes, this does actually work with her ability to immediately win. So let's say your sorry ass ended up in a combo highlight reel, and you know that you're just going to play around it next time, right? By just attacking with less units than whatever Fiora has left to kill, right? That seems like good counterplay. You're playing the game, you're being smart, you're learning from your mistakes. Well, that's exactly what the Fiora player wants you to do, because you might not be able to end the game fast enough suddenly. And you certainly aren't pressing the advantage that you've built for yourself by smartly underplaying and avoiding Fiora's combat moments and punishing spells and barriers, or however else you managed to survive to this point. So it seems somehow fitting for a deck like this to also have a spell that punishes you for being ahead on board. So, as you can see, there are various factors that go into not just the concept of Fiora as alternate win condition, but also just the overall power level and oppressive aspects of the deck as a whole. And again, not just Fiora herself. And this is a real shame, because Fiora, as a champion in Legends of Runeterra, is actually quite flavorful, with her abilities mirroring her ultimate from League of Legends, the Grand Challenge, with the 4 quadrants of stained glass. Really, really cool. Fantastic art. She even has the challenger keyword once again, which allows her to choose her targets in combat, fitting her theme as a skilled duelist, challenging her opponents to single combat. She also carries that creeping fear, right, of the enemy carry getting fed, just like in League of Legends. But as she exists right now, it's just not a fun deck to play against. Sometimes they might not draw the cards they need, or other times they're just going to have all the barriers in the world, and you aren't going to be able to contest the Fiora, even if you are playing a deck that can maybe play units that are bigger than her, right? So thinking about ways that we can change Fiora to maybe make her a bit more healthy outside of just a straight rework of her ability, there's still some additional ideas that they could kick around to play around with, her ultimate theme and the 4 vital points motif that she has as a champion. Maybe just make her have less base stats. Right now she's a 3 mana 3/3, which is, just basically an on curve sort of play. If she had lower base stats, her kills would be harder to get. She would require a bit more support, a little bit more, nuance from the opponent who is playing her against you in order to get that big payoff in the end. Typically, alternate win conditions, part of the satisfaction of achieving them is that, again, it is quite difficult or something that's not going to happen a lot of the time. They could maybe also make it so that she doesn't gain the challenger keyword until she gets her first 2 kills, right? The fact that she levels up, becomes a slightly stronger version of herself, sort of again speaks to that I am now a fed carry sort of League of Legends gameplay flavoring that they could play into. Alternatively, if the developers end up doing a rebalance of the factions, the regions, about like what cards are available to them, if deny gets reworked, if the amount of barrier generation in Demacia and Ionia is reworked, or maybe some of these spells lose their burst status, so there's a little bit more ways to interact with the deck. We could see Fiora go way down in power level regardless, or again down the road, if the meta were to shift to not being so combat focused. But, that's looking way, way, way into the future. I really want to draw attention to this problem now before it becomes a really, really big headache for the developers. Because as it stands right now, if somebody plays Fiora against you, and the only real way to just deny her outright is just not to develop any units. But the problem with that is Fiora is either going to put you on a 4-turn clock, right, to kill 4 targets, maybe even less than that, depending on how certain spells line up, or she's just going to hit you directly in the face repeatedly, and you're still on like a 5-turn clock, right, with her 3 attack and whatever other units are being developed. So those are my thoughts on Fiora right now. If you had any additional ideas about how Fiora could be changed, or whether or not she even needs to be changed, you can let me know in the comment section below. Also, let me know what other cards you played with or saw in Legends of Runeterra you think might also be a balance issue going into the next phase of preview testing for November. Thank you very much for tuning in. I will see you next time, and you have a good one.